In these talks, I've had to say a good deal about prayer. And before going on to my main subject tonight, I'd like to deal with a difficulty some people find about the whole idea of prayer. Somebody put it to me by saying, I can believe in God all right, but what I can't swallow is this idea of him listening to several 100 million human beings who are all addressing him at the same moment. And I find quite a lot of people feel that difficulty. Well, the first thing to notice is that the whole sting of it comes in the words, at the same moment. Most of us can imagine a God attending to any number of claimants, if only they come one by one, and he has an endless time to do it in. So what's really at the back of the difficulty is this idea of God having to fit too many things into one moment of time. Well, that of course is what happens to us. Our life comes to us moment by moment. One moment disappears before the next comes along, and there's room for precious little in each. That's what time is like. And of course, you and I tend to take it for granted that this time series, this arrangement of past, present, and future, isn't simply the way life comes to us, but is the way all things really exist. We tend to assume that the whole universe, and God himself, are always moving on from a past to a future, just as we are. But many learned men don't agree with that. I think it was the theologians who first started the idea that some things are not in time at all. Later, the philosophers took it over, and now some of the scientists are doing the same. Almost certainly, God is not in time. His life doesn't consist of moments following one another. If 1 million people are praying to him at 10:30 tonight, he hasn't got to listen to them all in that one little snippet which we call 10:30. 10:30, and every other moment from the beginning to the end of the world is always the present for him. If you like to put it that way, he has infinity in which to listen to the split second of prayer put up by a pilot as his plane crashes in flames. That's difficult, I know. Can I try to give something not the same, but a bit like it? Suppose I'm writing a novel. I write, Mary laid down her book, next moment came a knock at the door. For Mary, who's got to live in the imaginary time of the story, there's no interval between putting down the book and hearing the knock. But I, her creator, between writing the first part of that sentence and the second, may have gone out for an hour's walk and spent the whole hour thinking about Mary. I know that's not a perfect example, but it may just give a glimpse of what I mean. The point I want to drive home is that God has infinite attention, infinite leisure to spare for each one of us. He doesn't have to take us in the lump. You're as much alone with him as if you were the only thing he'd ever created. When Christ died, he died for you individually, just as much as if you'd been the only man in the world. And now I'll get back to my main subject. I was pointing out last time that the Christian life is simply a process of having your natural self changed into a Christ self, and that this process goes on very far inside. One's most private wishes, one's point of view are the things that have to be changed. That's why unbelievers complain that Christianity is a very selfish religion. Isn't it very selfish, even morbid, they say, to be always bothering about the inside of your own soul, instead of thinking of humanity? Now, what would an NCO say to a soldier who had a dirty rifle and when told to clean it replied, "But, Sergeant, isn't it very selfish, even morbid, to be always bothering about the inside of your own rifle, instead of thinking of the United Nations?" Well, we needn't bother about what the NCO would actually say. You see the point? The man's not going to be much use to the United Nations if his rifle isn't fit to shoot with. In the same way, people who are still acting from their old natural selves won't do much real permanent good to other people. Let me explain that. History isn't just a story of bad people doing bad things. It's quite as much a story of people trying to do good things, but somehow something goes wrong. Take the common expression, cold as charity. How do we come to say that? From experience. We've learnt how unsympathetic, patronizing, and conceited charitable people often are. And yet, hundreds and thousands of them started out really anxious to do good, and when they'd done it, somehow it just wasn't as good as it ought to have been. The old story. What you are comes out in what you do. A crab-apple tree can't produce eating apples. As long as the old self is there, its taint will be over all we do. We try to be religious and become Pharisees. We try to be kind and become patronizing. Social service ends in red tape and officialdom. Unselfishness becomes a form of showing off. I don't mean, of course, that we're to stop trying to be good. We've got to do the best we can. If the soldier's fool enough to go into battle with a dirty rifle, he mustn't run away. But I do mean that the real cure lies far deeper. Out of ourselves and into Christ we must go. The change won't, for most of us, happen suddenly. And I must admit that for most Christians, it'll only be beginning to the very end of our present lives. But there are some in whom it goes further, even before death, far enough for you to see it. Their very faces and voices are different. When you meet them, you know you're up against something which, so to speak, begins where you leave off. Something stronger, quieter, happier, more alive than ordinary humanity.
A plaintive lament from the epic movie trilogy, The Lord of the Rings. There is, though, little to lament about the Tolkien brand. A staggering 150 million people have bought the books, 50 million of those since the film trilogy wowed fans and critics alike. J.R.R. Tolkien's classic work of fantasy started out in his mind as a book written for his children.
I read to my children, then read the two elder ones, who took kindly, and on the whole, favourable interest in it. But they criticised very severely, and first opened my eyes to the whole situation which led to my essay on fairy story, criticised very severely all those things in which, by owing to bad models, I thought was suitable to put into children's story. They hated asides, anything like, so now I've told you enough. They loathed anything that made it sound as if you were talking to an actual audience.
The audience for Tolkien's books remains voracious and committed. And now, some 50 years after the publication of The Lord of the Rings, the Tolkien Literary Estate have published a new work, The Children of Húrin. Tolkien began writing it in the trenches during the First World War. Parts of it, though, have been seen before.
The Children of Húrin hasn't been published as a standalone tale. And it's been published in works, and also it was a long time ago, before, among other things, before the films made Tolkien doubly, triply popular. And it's published in what are scholarly works. And you can read the stories just for the stories, skipping the notes, but you're not going to get a simple start-to-finish story. And they're published with the name of very exact literary analysis, which means that if the story, it's one version of the story, and if it's interrupted, it stops there, whereas the Children of Hurin, the new book, is worked together from all the author's words, but to become a standalone story that can be read as such.
However, fans of Bilbo Baggins may be in for a bit of a shock with the Children of Hurin. It is a dark tale of incest and betrayal, and one in which most of the protagonists kill themselves or each other.
I think a bit too much is being made of the incest. It's part of the tragedy of the story, that this brother and sister don't know that they're brother and sister. But it is definitely a tragic tale. But I don't know. I don't know what people will make of it. It takes place in a part of Middle-earth that doesn't exist anymore when The Lord of the Rings takes place, but it's very much Middle-earth. It's very much the same world. And it's a more serious tale, in a sense, than The Lord of the Rings.
While The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings remain the most popular of Tolkien's books, his more obscure works, dealing with the ancient history of elves and men, were to him all part of the same mythic tapestry.
There are in existence a very large collection, now collected and practically written, but legends about the world of the past, particularly after the exiled elves came back and conducted their war against the devil in the northwestern part of this world we live in, and the connection of the men who joined in with them.
We hope to strike a chord in people who've discovered the stories of Middle-earth with The Lord of the Rings, but who don't really know about the other works, or who've found them too difficult. And we think that this tale in particular, which was one tale that the author did work at enough so that we can produce a full-length story, it's a beautiful tale in itself, and it may or may not strike a chord. People may think that it doesn't have enough hobbits in it, because there aren't any.
And it basically boils down to this. There are 3 steps you take in establishing the existence of God. Now, the person has to listen very carefully, because I take them through the 3 stages. Step number 1 is this, Jim. However you section physical reality, you take the physical universe as you see it, however you slice it down to its minutest form, the fact of the matter is you end up with a physical entity or quantity that does not have the reason for its existence in itself. Ultimately, the physical universe reduced in any form cannot explain its own origin. It has to find its explanation outside of itself, which means the first explanation of a universe as we see it has to have something that is non-physical as a first cause. So you've got a kind of a haunted universe without knowing what the first cause is. Next you come to the argument for what we call not from design, but to design. And that's what I said. If you walk onto a planet and see a wrapper of a McDonald's hamburger and see letters of an alphabet, you immediately know that there is information there. And logic tells you, Jim, as it tells everybody listening, where you see information, you assume that prior to that information is a mind. You don't just think that Handel's Hallelujah Chorus came together, or that the dictionary developed because of an explosion in a printing press. There is sequence to the whole thing. And if you take, Jim, just the composition of the enzyme in the human component, the enzyme, which is the building block of the gene, and the gene the building block of the cell, the possibility of the human enzyme coming together by random, says Vikram Singhi, professor of applied mathematics at Cardiff in Wales, the possibility of that happening by chance is 1 in 10 to the power of 40,000. That's more than the number of atoms in this universe.
That's amazing.
It is time-wise and mathematically, the possibility is 0. So I say to you, number 1, the physical quantity cannot explain itself. Number 2, there's intelligibility, which assumes a prior mind. In the first case, there is something non-physical. Second case, there is something intellectual or a mind. And third, in the history of society, human experience, and history itself, you begin to realize that the moral issues, the social issues, and just human intercourse demands the explanation of a moral reality. So you've got a first cause that is spiritual, a first cause that is mind, a first cause that needs to explain morality. You take these three struggles, Jim, and pause with me for a moment here. There are four fundamental questions in life: origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. You take these four questions and these three explanations needed, and only God is big enough to explain this universe.
What are the four great discoveries of modern science that prove God exists? The first great discovery of modern science is that the universe had a beginning. Where did it come from? Historian of science Fred Burnham has written, "The God hypothesis is now a more persuasive and respectable hypothesis than at any time in the last 100 years. The second great scientific discovery is that space and time also had a beginning. This discovery demands an explanation. It calls for a transcendent cause beyond the universe itself. The third great discovery of modern science is that the laws and constants of the universe have been fine-tuned for human life to exist. As physicist Fred Hoyle has written, a common-sense interpretation of the evidence suggests a super-intellect has monkeyed with physics and chemistry as well as biology to make life possible. The fourth great discovery of modern science is the digital code embedded in the DNA molecule in every human cell. The 3 billion characters of precise information in the digital code instruct the cell how to build complex molecules to do the work so the cell can stay alive. Where did this specified information come from? It is compelling evidence of an intelligent designer for the origin of human life. My guest today, who will explain these four great scientific discoveries, is Dr. Stephen Meyer, who received his PhD in the philosophy of science from Cambridge University. He is co-founder of the intelligent design movement in the world and a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute. We invite you to join us for this special edition of the John Ankerberg Show. Welcome to our program. We're talking to Dr. Stephen Meyer, philosopher of science who got his PhD at Cambridge in England. He's written a best-selling book, Signature in the Cell, that we've been looking at in past programs, DNA and the Evidence for Intelligent Design. And we want to carry on from where we've been talking about the beginning of the universe and the implications that science has given to us because of the beginning of the universe. We're going to turn the corner and add the evidence onto the evidence. And we're going to talk about the anthropic fine-tuning. What does anthropic fine-tuning mean?
Well, anthros is the Greek for man, and the idea is that the universe in its physical laws and constants, which we can talk about in a bit, are finely tuned to allow for the possibility of human life. It's as if the universe were a setup job to set the stage for the existence of life and the existence of human life. We've been talking in previous shows about the evidence for intelligent design in biology, in the digital code that's stored in the DNA molecule, and some of the other evidences. But what we have here in physics is evidence for intelligent design built into the very fabric of the universe. And this is highly significant because if you think about what the theory of intelligent design says is that some kind of intelligence was involved, it played a role in the origin of life. But from the evidence in biology alone, you can't decide whether that intelligence was immanent within the cosmos, some kind of space alien or intelligence within the universe as a whole, or whether the intelligence responsible for the origin of life was transcendent beyond the universe. What we have in the anthropic fine-tuning is evidence for design built into the very fabric of the universe itself. Clearly not something that could be explained by any being within the universe. And so I think it tips the scales in the direction of a theistic design hypothesis and points to the need for a God who is the designer, an intelligent agent who transcends matter, space, time, and energy. And so with the evidence from the new cosmology, from the Big Bang and general relativity, we saw that there was a need for some kind of transcendent cause. One candidate for that might be an agent that has the attributes we associate with God. With the anthropic fine-tuning evidence, we're going to see additional evidence that supports that thesis, because it's also going to point not just to the transcendent nature of the cause, but also to its intelligence. And more succinctly, what I think the fine-tuning evidence shows is that there's compelling evidence for intelligent design in the entire universe, and it comes in the form of this fine-tuning of the laws and constants of physics, and also of the initial conditions. And therefore, intelligent design provides the best explanation for this evidence. And I'm going to go further and say that the kind of design that's necessary is a design that transcends the universe as a whole, and therefore we're looking at something that is decidedly theistic. We're looking at a God hypothesis.
Okay, one of those things that backs it up is the expansion of the universe, the rate of the expansion of the universe. Describe what that is.
That's a good place to start, because we've been talking about the expanding universe in previous programs, and it turns out that the rate of expansion is finely tuned to allow for the possibility of life. If the universe were to expand even a little tiny bit faster, then life, the universe would dissipate. The heat and energy of the universe would dissipate too quickly, and we wouldn't form stable galaxies. If it had expanded a little tiny bit slower, we would have gotten a big crunch. The gravitational forces would have overcome the rate of expansion, and all of the universe, the matter in the universe, would have crunched back on itself. So it turns out that the fine-tuning of the expansion rate of the universe is exquisite. It's fine-tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 60th power. That's about the same as $1 out of a trillion dollars. Now, of course, with the federal budget deficit and everything, that may not seem like that much to people today, but this is exquisite fine-tuning. If you're an engineer and you're familiar with the concept of tolerances, you realize that the tolerance here for error is minuscule, and yet the universe is just right to allow for the possibility of life.
This is also called a cosmological constant.
Well, the expansion rate of the universe is related to a deeper, more fundamental parameter called the cosmological constant. That's the constant that Einstein was fiddling with to try to restore a static balance in the universe. Fiddling with in his mind, not in reality. And yeah, that's a very important fine-tuning parameter.
It's actually the balance between the expansion out and the pulling back in.
Exactly. And our universe is finely tuned so the expansion just barely exceeds the contractive force of gravity. And it turns out you need that finely tuned just as the way it is to allow for the possibility of life.
But that's not the only anthropic fine-tuning principle that the scientists have found. What are some of the others?
Well, there are about 25 to 30 of these separate parameters that are each exquisitely finely tuned to allow for the possibility of life in the universe. And in each case, there's a kind of a not too hot, not too cold aspect of it. If you think back to Goldilocks, we're the Goldilocks universe. For example, with the gravitational force constant.
It's just right.
It's just right. It's just right, and it's right over and over and over again with these many separate parameters. For example, with the gravitational force constant, if it's fine-tuned to about 1 part in 10 to the 40th, which is, again, an incredibly small tolerance. And if the gravitational force is larger, then stars would be too hot, they'd burn up too quickly and too unevenly. If the gravitational force constant is smaller, then stars would remain too cool, so that nuclear fusion would never ignite, and hence we'd have no heavy element production, therefore no planets like our own. So in each case, if you get it off by a little bit, then something bad happens that would make the universe impossible. Now, many people aren't familiar with the idea of constants, because you got to kind of be a physics geek to be into this. But basically, every equation has a proportion between one variable and another, and there's a quantitative aspect to that proportion that's expressed by what's called a constant of proportionality. So you could imagine, I used to admire the Russian pole vaulter Sergei Bubka. Now imagine that Sergei is running down the tarmac, and he's a man of about 200 pounds. The Earth has a given mass, and therefore there's the proportion between those two masses generates a particular force, or there's a force generated between those two masses. But the gravitational force constant tells you how much force is generated given everything else being equal, Sergei's weight and the weight of the universe. Now, imagine Sergei's running down the tarmac, ready to do his jump, and somebody fiddles with the gravitational force constant and makes it pull gravity twice as hard as it would otherwise do. What's going to happen? Well, he's going to come crashing to the Earth. Imagine somebody twiddles the dial the other way. Now he's going to sail way above and set a new world record. So what physicists realize is that these constants have precise values that determine, for example, how strong gravity is, and they could be otherwise. And as they examine them carefully, they realize if they were even a tiny bit different in either direction, a little bit stronger, a little bit weaker, life would be impossible in the universe. And that's true not just of gravitation, of the expansion rate of the universe, it's true of numerous separate factors, whether we're talking about the speed of light, the ratio of fundamental forces in physics, all kinds of different things. And that's what's so striking about this.
All right, Steve, you got a great illustration of what you're talking about. Show the folks.
Well, it's really from John Polkinghorne, one of the leading physicists from Cambridge University. I've simply made a visual to go with the idea, but in order to get across the idea of the anthropic fine-tuning, he asks his readers to imagine a universe-creating machine. And maybe you're out in space. You're going to you land at a space station, and there's you go inside, and there's a room that says universe creating machine. You go in, and each one of the dials, there's dials for every one of the fundamental forces of physics. There's a dial for the expansion rate of the universe, for the gravitational force constant, for the ratio of the different fundamental forces. There's a little slider for the speed of light, and it turns out that each one of these is set to a very precise value. And since you're a physicist, you take out your pencil from behind your ear and start making some calculations. You realize, if we changed any one of those values, if we spun the dial a little tiny click this way or a little tiny click that way, move that slider a little bit one way or in the other, life wouldn't be possible. Now, what do you make of that? Now, Polkinghorne, he has a charming way of saying it. He says, well, I don't say that the atheists are stupid. He says, I think that theism, the theistic design hypothesis, provides a better explanation. Mm-hmm. And this has been a kind of universal reaction among physicists at a kind of intuitive level. Fred Hoyle, the famous British astrophysicist who spent a lot of his career trying to get around the implications of the Big Bang Theory by posing other models to explain away the beginning of the universe, eventually came to realize that the fine-tuning evidence provided compelling evidence of design. Hoyle says that a common sense interpretation of the data suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics and chemistry as well as biology to make life possible. And I always get a kick out of this because the monkeys always seem to make it into the origins debate, even when we're talking about physics. But I think Hoyle's exactly right here. A common sense interpretation of this fine-tuning suggests that there was a fine-tuner, intelligence, a super intellect that was responsible. And since the evidence of design that we're looking at is built into the very fabric of the universe, right from the very beginning, I think what we're looking at is not something that can be explained by any designing intelligence or agents within the cosmos. Richard Dawkins has, thrown out the idea that, well, maybe there might be an alien intelligence that's responsible for what he calls the signature of intelligence in life. That kind of intelligence can't explain this evidence. This evidence points to the need for an intelligence beyond the cosmos that could build the design into the universe as a whole. So I think this is a compelling new development in science that has, again, very positive theistic implications.
Folks, this is fantastic information. I hope you're catching the drift of all of this and what it means. But we're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about there are still objections to this evidence. And we're going to hear about that when we come right back. All right, we're back. We're talking with Dr. Stephen Meyer, philosopher of science, and we started this series. We talked about Richard Dawkins saying there's no evidence for a designer. You got a garden, you got no gardener. And what we're seeing.
I think we can trust the Bible because it has been demonstrated in terms of archaeology, in terms of fulfilled prophecy, and especially because of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, perhaps the greatest evidence of all. But I think when it comes to knowing the accuracy of the Bible, the best proof is the fact that it can be trusted. It can be trusted in what it tells us about God. It can be trusted in history, in geography, on everything that it touches. The only thing we need to be clear about is whether that particular word is the commitment of the author. But once we understand what the truth, commitment, the teaching of the author is, then I think we can say that that is totally dependable. And this is what the church and believers through the ages have found to be true.
Okay, what is the biblical pattern of sanctification, the biblical paradigm, the biblical means of sanctification? It starts here, in my flesh dwells no good thing. Left to myself and to my intuition and to my spirituality and to my spiritual insight and to my mystical feelings, I'm going nowhere. I'm going to go nowhere. I'm going to end up in terrible frustration, living some kind of an illusion that my spiritual feelings are a true sanctification. Sanctification is as much a work of the Holy Spirit as salvation is. I can't effect my own salvation by my intuition and my spirituality, nor can I effect my sanctification that way. It is the work of the Spirit. And listen to this, the means, the agent that the Spirit uses is the Scripture. That, by the testimony of Jesus in John 17:17, where in praying to the Father for all who would believe in Him, He said to the Father, "Sanctify them by Thy truth. Thy word is truth." Sanctification is the power of the Spirit activating the truth of Scripture in the life of a believer. Don't look inside. Don't contemplate your spiritual navel. Don't look inside your intuition and your mystical feelings to find the path of sanctification. Look to the Word of God. That is the instrument the Holy Spirit uses.
I'd like to take a moment to welcome you today, Stephen, to be with us here on this program. I understand that we do have some common basis in this type of work. I was on the Truth Project for Del Tackett and Focus on the Family.
Yeah, very good.
And I understand you were very important to the True You project that was produced by the same people. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I was before I went full-time with Discovery Institute 7 years ago, I was a college professor for 12 years and found that I had a lot of college students that were in that period of life when they were trying to decide what they really believed about fundamental issues. They were involved in a lot of soul searching and deliberation, and I used to get the English majors and the philosophy majors who couldn't sleep at night coming to my office to talk about the big questions. And one of them was a football player who was I had misjudged as a big dumb jock, and he was in fact probably one of the top 2 or 3 students I ever had. And I was at a religious college, a Presbyterian school, and he had not come for the Christian mission of the school. He'd come to chase girls and play football.
Right.
But he was encountering young women who had a sincere Christian faith who weren't interested in dating him because they had a different worldview. And he began to probe and ask, well, why do you believe in Christianity? And he got frustrated because so many times he'd get the answer, well, to hard questions, you get the answer, I don't know, you just have to have faith. So he came to my office one day, and I wouldn't say he knocked on the door, he banged on the door, and I thought this only can be one guy, and I got up, and sure enough it was my big football player friend, and he was very frustrated because he'd had a conversation about the historical reliability of the Bible or the problem of evil or something, and he wasn't getting satisfactory answers, and he said, why can't someone around here give you some reasons for faith? And his hands were kind of approaching uncomfortably my neck, and I thought, so out of self-defense as much as anything else, I said, well, why don't we do a course on that? And I'll never forget the look on his face, because he just stopped dead in his tracks, and he said, you mean you think there are some? And I said, well, of course I do, or else I wouldn't be a Christian. And he said, I'd be very interested in something about that. And so we devised a course. I had a lot of faculty colleagues who were, half a generation ahead of me. They'd come of age in the 60s. They were pretty much all Kierkegaardian and into the blind leap of faith. And I got some ribbing when I put up posters for this class from older faculty, but it seemed to scratch where the students were itching. I had a great turnout for the very first class, not because I had offered anything great, but just because it was a topic. Students wanted to know if there were reasons for faith. Anyway, long story short, that was my signature course at Whitworth, where I taught for 12 years, and then at some other schools. And when Focus on the Family was looking to do something for high school and college kids, they approached me about doing that course on camera as what Del Tackett called the prequel to the Truth Project, because the Truth Project does a fabulous job of explaining what a Christian worldview means for all these different spheres of life. If you have a Christian worldview, how does that play out in marriage and family? How does it play out in business, in science, in government? But it left unanswered the question, why should you adopt a Christian worldview in the first place? Which is what my course attempted to do. It actually makes a cumulative case for biblical Christianity. And so it's a kind of a complement to what Del has so ably done for adults. Yes. It really targeted towards the last year in high school and the first few years in college, when so many students of faith are encountering that hostility from the secular professorate.
You know, I've often said that we live in the most anti-intellectual period in Christian history. Not anti-scientific, but anti-mind, anti-rationality. And it's become pervasive throughout the church, this whole idea of you have to take your Christianity by faith, take a leap in the dark and hope somebody's out there to catch you. It is Kierkegaardian to an extreme.
Yeah.
And yet Christianity is profoundly rational. From beginning to end, it addresses the mind. There can be no affection in the heart that doesn't first come through the mind.
This was the motto I used to have on my office door, and then I'd used it in the Reasons for Faith class. I may have heard this from someone else, but I used to tell my students, the heart cannot exult in what the mind rejects. And I found so many times with students who were losing their faith, very oftentimes at Christian colleges, this happens and was happening, it was because they were encountering intellectual objections to the faith that started to erode their subjective passion for Christ or for the Bible. And it happens very often at seminaries. And we used to, we had a very a strong religion and philosophy department where I was at Whitworth of mainly believing, in fact, entirely believing professors who used to agonize over where to send their students to seminary because they realized that they'd often go to seminary and encounter these, for lack of a better term, the higher critical deconstruction of the text, yes, of the biblical text. Now there's more sophisticated, more avant-garde ways of doing the deconstruction than just the 19th century higher criticism, but you know what I mean, the attempt to undermine students' confidences in the basic historical reliability of the biblical witness. So,
but isn't it wonderful that this football student could see through all of that and come to you and ask you?
Interesting, yeah.
Augustine said, you know, that there's a difference between faith and credulity. And faith that is irrational is simple credulity, and that honors no one.
I think that's right. And what we've come to rely on as faith, or what we've come to associate with faith in our contemporary culture, is really a feeling. And I've had the sense that the ultimate issue in our time is what my colleague in the ID movement, Philip Johnson, he says. He puts it this way. He said, the ultimate issue is God real or imaginary? There are plenty of people who are willing to concede an imaginary God or a God as concept that gives you subjective comfort, but that comfort is cold and not very lasting in the face of all the things that buffet us in life if there isn't some conviction that's also based on truth.
Well, you know, this crosses the street to the other disciplines as well. When I was teaching philosophy in the university, I had a senior elective course, and on one occasion the question of macroevolution came up. And I just asked the students, there were some 30 students in the class, how many of you believe in macroevolution? And 29 hands went up. And I said, well, I'm not here today to debate that particular issue. But we were studying epistemology at the time, and I said, what I'd like to know is what arguments have persuaded you of this position? And I went to the blackboard and I took up a piece of chalk and I wrote 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to list the 5 most compelling arguments that had persuaded them of this position. I had one student who later became a postdoc student in study of the brain who said common substance means common source, and I wrote that on the board. And I said, what else? And for all my endeavors, I couldn't pry another reason out of them except the one they kept saying, this is what I've always been taught.
All reasonable people agree.
Yes,
that's
right. Exactly. But they couldn't reproduce
an
the
argument.
case. Yeah.
And yet what's so striking about The Origin of Species is that Darwin self-consciously is prosecuting an argument. He calls the book One Long Argument for the idea of universal common descent being produced by his mechanism of natural selection. That's the descent with modification. So he's very much stands in the tradition of the rhetoric of science. He's as did Newton. You know, he's making an argument for a radical new way of looking at life, and yet most people who have accepted the conclusion of that argument can't reproduce even the most basic of the arguments for the proposition. And what that shows is the power of essentially a form of indoctrination that takes place where students are told the conclusion without the supporting documentation. Exactly. And science has moved on a bit since 1859. There's some reasons to question that theory. So, I admire Darwin and the way he put together his case, but we've learned a lot since his time, and so...
But usually it takes an abundance of anomalies before a hypothesis is surrendered.
Yeah, that's exactly right. But the abundance of anomalies has accumulated. And
I know.
Of course, Darwin knew nothing in the 1850s about genetics. When Mendel came along just a little later, his theory had to be revised in light of that. But you know, since the revolution of Watson and Crick and the molecular biological revolution that ensued, there's a lot of new data to take into account in looking at life's origins.
You were involved in the movie project with Ben Stein, Expelled,
right.
The issue of intelligent design. And we have this enormous prejudice out there against any consideration of ID, as we said. What do you think motivates that negative response?
Well, partly what you just said. When people are uncomfortable with their own intellectual position, or when they don't fully understand the basis of it, there's a kind of insecurity that ensues. It's one of the things that attracted Ben Stein to the project when he learned about the case of Richard Sternberg at the Smithsonian Institution and how he'd been treated. In the super trailer to the film, he said, in my experience, this is not the way people who are confident in their intellectual position act. And when he saw these cases of suppression, of retribution being enacted against very competent scientists, that to him, as a non-scientist, but as a very shrewd guy, was an indicator that the people defending the Darwinian orthodoxy were actually insecure about their position. You don't resort to power if you can instead provide a compelling counter-argument. And so I think that's part of it. There's this sociological dimension, this sense that all reasonable people agree, and we're not sure why, but all reasonable people agree. Therefore, if you dissent, you're not reasonable by definition, and you have to be suppressed or excluded.
There's also an antipathy and hostility there towards Christianity, and a fear that ID will introduce.
People don't like where it's leading.
That's right. The way they don't want that. Yeah. But there's also, what I have seen is a fundamental fear of the intrusion of philosophy into the scientific realm. And when I look at this as a philosopher, I have to smile a little bit because the scientific community's it's pervaded with naturalism.
Well,
naturalism is a philosophy.
Exactly. The Darwinian establishment's doing philosophy, and in a very bad way. The way it works. First, comment about back to just revisiting your first question about what's driving this. I have a friendly debating partner Michael Ruse, who's a committed Darwinist, but a genuine good guy, and very congenial. And Michael and I, squared off a number of times. But he's written a very important book in which he explains that Darwinism has functioned for many scientists as a kind of secular religion. Right. And the commitment that is manifested in some of these expelled-like cases is a kind of almost fanatical zeal. And I think it's typical of what happens to people. It's the human condition. When you have fundamentally, or when you have deeply held personal beliefs that are challenged by evidence that you don't know how to respond to, very often, if any person's in that situation, they respond emotionally, sometimes somewhat irrationally, sometimes by resorting to power rather than persuasion. Yes. And so that's human nature, and I think that's part of what's driving the extreme hostility that we find now in the Darwinian community as it's directed to against people like Richard Sternberg or Guillermo Gonzalez or any number of the others whose cases were documented in the film Expelled.
Well, Stephen, you've dropped a bombshell on the playground of the scientists with your book and the signature in the cell, which speaks of the relationship of, I guess, molecular biology with intelligent design. Can you tell us a little bit about the central thesis of that?
Yeah, sure. I wrote the book in 2007 and got it out in 2009. But I'd been stewing on it for a long time. The idea for it is kind of embarrassing, but my son was a year old and I finished it when he was 18 as a senior in high school. But I got interested in the mid-'80s in what I call in the book the DNA enigma, the mystery of the origin of the information that's necessary to build life. And I became interested in this because I attended a conference in the mid-'80s that had a huge seminar in the middle of it on the origin of life problem with some world-class people in the field. And I had a double major in science as an undergraduate. I was working as a geophysicist, and I was under the impression that the evolutionary biologists had this question all sewn up. And I was shocked to realize that some of the top people in the field, I mean almost all, acknowledged that the field of origin of life research is what it's called, was the field was in a state of complete impasse. And that the fundamental question that was tripping up the scientists trying to account for the origin of life was the origin of the information that's encoded in DNA. It's one thing to do these experiments and build these chemicals, get them to arise through undirected chemical interactions. It's quite another to get the chemical constituents of the key molecules in life, like the DNA and the proteins and the RNA, to line up in the right way, to become sequenced or arranged to store information. And what we now know about life is that information runs the show inside the cell. I used to ask my students a question, if you want to give your computer a new function, what do you have to give it? And they would know right away. They're under 40, the information, code, software. Well, the same thing is true in life. If you want to build a new form of life from a simpler pre-existing form, you've got to have instructions inside the cell to build the proteins and the protein parts you need for those new parts of new forms of life. Same thing is true if you want to build life in the first place. You've got to have information in the DNA molecule. And so that's the fundamental question that I addressed in the book. And I argued that that intelligent design, in fact, provides a solution to that mystery.
When you think about all that information that's there and impacted in the least of these elements, I can't help but go back to Aristotle and think the same thing. Aristotle's theory of the entelechy. I don't know if you ever counted that.
The purpose for which something is made.
Yes, so that's why an acorn becomes an oak tree and not an elephant.
Right.
That it's already inside. There's an entelechy, an intelligence within that, encoded, to make sure that acorn doesn't become a kangaroo or
and what he would have given to know about the molecular biological revolution.
Exactly.
Because there's the Greeks were fascinated with form and the origin of form.
Right.
And we now know that at the root of the origin of form is information. And this was the key discovery in the 1950s. We all know about the discovery of Watson and Crick and the famous double helix structure of DNA. But 4 or 5 years later, Crick put forward a brilliant hypothesis. It was called the sequence hypothesis. And it was subsequently confirmed. And Crick had the insight to realize that along the spine of the DNA molecule there are 4 chemicals, and that these 4 chemicals are functioning just like alphabetic characters in a written language or digital characters in a machine code, which is to say it's not the chemical or physical properties of those chemicals, they're called the bases, but rather it's their sequential arrangement that gives them their function. Just like Scrabble letters. You know, it's not the little plastic in the letter that is important. It's if you get the letters arranged right to spell a word and land on that triple word score. It's the sequential arrangement that's key to function. And this was, I think, the most important insight of modern biology. And then it was subsequently confirmed, and it sparked the whole molecular biological revolution, which was essentially the realization that information is running the show inside life. We're having an information revolution in our high-tech world. But it's almost uncanny that at about the same time we're inventing this high-tech information technology, we've also discovered it inside life, even in the very simplest cells. Information, therefore, is really the key.
Is anybody in these days brutish enough to deny the obvious presence of design?
Well, of course there are folks, and I'm encountering them all the time on the internet and in various reviews, but I think that the tide in this debate is beginning to shift, because most people, and I mean high-tech people, scientists, recognize the connection between information and intelligence.
Right.
I was standing on the soccer
but
sidelines.
I wasn't asking about intelligent design, just
design.
But I wasn't asking about intelligent design, just
design. Oh, yeah. Well, even the Darwinists acknowledge design, but they want to say it's apparent.
Yes.
They want to say, Richard Dawkins says, biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose, where the key word is appearance.
Right.
And that's, by the way, the origin of the term intelligent design. When we were beginning to realize that there was compelling evidence of intelligent causation, was the way some of the early ID pioneers put it, we were casting about for a name for our theory. And we wanted to contrast it clearly with the central proposition of the Darwinian synthesis, which is that things look designed, but they're not really designed because there's a purely undirected process that's sufficient to produce the appearance of design, the illusion of design. And so we thought the way to make clear what we were arguing against and also what we were for was to contrast the idea of intelligent design with merely apparent design, which is the key, the Darwinian view. And so Richard Dawkins acknowledges, for example, that the machine code of the genes, as he puts it, is uncannily computer-like. It looks like something that was designed by a software programmer, but he wants to hold out for an explanation that will account for that appearance apart from an actual mind or intelligence having played a role.
Sort of an unintelligent intelligence.
Yes, exactly. The idea is that you have a purely undirected process producing the appearance of design, and the undirected process is not guided or directed in any way.
And as soon as we say design, to talk about intelligent design is almost, if not altogether, a redundancy.
But you would think, but this is the counterintuitive nature of the Darwinian proposal.
Exactly. But going back to Kant and his critique of pure reason and his critique of the traditional arguments for God, and he dismissed the cosmological and the ontological and all of that. The one thing he said that really burdened him was the teleological argument, the argument from design. Even then, he talked about the starry skies above and the moral law within, that those were the two things he really couldn't get a handle on. And David Hume, who's considered the father of all this skepticism, had the same sense of burden and reacted against those people who wanted to substitute chance as this power, when, of course, chance has no power because it has no ontology. But since these two men...
Yeah, it's a name for something.
Yes, that we don't know what.
Yeah, exactly.
So, but it's interesting how fiercely people oppose the idea of the presence of intelligence when the design is overwhelming. Some people follow it.
Let me just, a couple anecdotal things that underscore this and also, I think, help explain the key argument of the book. But I'm standing on the soccer sidelines watching my daughter play in a game a few years ago. She has a kind of gruff coach, shaved head, but he's a Microsoft programmer. And I had no idea he had any interest in the philosophy of science. Came up on the sideline when the game was in full flower, and he bumps kind of like this, and he says, "So what do these Darwinists think? The code just wrote itself?" And then he pauses and he says, "Not at Microsoft." And that was his take on the debate that I'm involved in. But it's actually a very compelling kind of observation. Bill Gates himself has said that DNA is like a software program, but much more complex than any we've ever created. And we know, and this gets to the central argument of the book, we know from experience, from uniform and repeated experience, which is the basis of all scientific reasoning, that programs always come from programmers. We know more generally that information in whatever form we find it, especially if it's in a digital or alphabetic form, always comes from an intelligent source, whether we're talking about a hieroglyphic inscription, a paragraph in a book, a headline in a newspaper, information embedded in a radio signal. Information always comes from an intelligent source, from a mind, not a material process. So the discovery of information embedded in digital form along the spine of the DNA molecule is a compelling indicator of prior intelligent activity. That's the central argument of the book, and it's something that I think is so almost commonsensical to people who have an intimate acquaintance with information technology, like Microsoft programmers, that the case for intelligent design, I think, is becoming very, very compelling. And we sense the debate is starting to shift in our favor because, in a sense, we own the metaphors. People understand information technology. They understand information processing systems. We are using those technologies all the time. We invent them. We create them. But we also know that information is the product of mind. It comes from no other source. There's only one known cause of a given effect. If you see the effect, you can reason back to the cause. And that's essentially what my book does.
Well, you know, the most celebrated atheist of Great Britain in the 20th century, even apart from Bertrand Russell, was Anthony Flew, who developed the famous parable, Flew's parable.
Right.
Where he finds this, the explorer comes into this jungle and finds this perfectly manicured garden, and which screamed for the reality of a garden, and he was skeptical about all of that, and now he has come full circle to embrace theism. And the key thing that got to Flew was he came to the understanding that if there is not design that is intelligible, there's no possibility for science of any kind to operate.
Right.
Because it's all chaos, and science itself becomes an illusion. And so the fact that if the world is designed, if it's orderly, then it's intelligible. And you don't get unintelligible intelligibility. That's what finally convinced him. He should have seen it in his own parable 50 years ago. But
he's a very interesting figure and a brilliant man.
Yes.
When the articles came out about his intellectual conversion in 2004, he was quoted as saying that his perspective on this bore some similarity to that of those American design theorists, as he put it. And he specifically cited the importance of the DNA argument and the fine-tuning arguments as having had a role in this change of mind. Your comment, though, about the importance of design to the whole scientific endeavor is a very important one. Oftentimes people will object to the work we're doing on intelligent design by saying it's a science stopper. But in fact, the idea of intelligent design was the science starter. There was a key word in the vocabulary of the scientists who started what we call the scientific revolution, that period in which modern science, as we know it, came to full flower between about 1300 and 1700. There was an assumption that they had, and that was that nature is intelligible. And they believed that it was intelligible because it was the product of a rational mind. And therefore, our minds, being made in the image of that rational mind, whom they took to be God, could understand the design, order, the patterns that were in nature, and that made it worth the hard work of interrogating nature, of investigating nature, because we would eventually get to that deeper underlying order or pattern or design as a result of those investigations. So Kepler put it really poetically, saying that the natural philosopher, the person we call the scientist today, has the high calling of thinking God's thoughts after him.
Yes, exactly.
So when people say, you know, design is a science starter or a stopper, I always say, well, it didn't seem to stop Sir Isaac Newton or Johannes Kepler.
Ultimate chaos is the science ender.
Yes, exactly.
And then you have to go down to the fact of whether this sense manifold that we have is the design that we find there's something that we impose upon chaos, or are we responding to something that's really there? That was the problem that Hume ended up with in his graveyard of empiricism, that Kant tried to save science from that kind of skepticism. Because if it's something that's pure subjectivity, there is no knowledge, which is what science is.
Right, and you can turn that as an argument against any particular argument for intelligent design based upon the empirical evidence of the natural world. You can say, well, it's just the human mind imposing that perception of design. It doesn't last very long, though, because we keep seeing it, you know. And
not only that, but then you have to account for the human beings.
That's the key
imposition,
and this is
intelligent imposition.
The work that Alvin Plantinga has done in making the case that the ultimate question in epistemology is, on what basis can we trust in the reliability of the human mind? The ultimate question in epistemology is, on what basis can we trust in the reliability of the human mind? And that's where I think intelligent design has something else really profound to contribute. Because if the mind is designed by a benevolent creator to know the world that creator has also designed, then there's a principle of correspondence between the way the mind works and the way the world has been designed, such that it can be known. And that's the ultimate guarantee. So I think in epistemology, of our ability to know. And so there's a kind of theistic design argument that underwrites the epistemological enterprise of science itself, which in some ways is the most fundamental argument for design and the one that I think makes science possible. And was something that was presupposed by all those early founders of modern science. They were not afflicted by Humean skepticism because they believed that the world had been designed by the same person who had designed their minds to know the world. And so they didn't have the problem.
They were aware of the limitations of sense perception, of the empirical pursuit. And they realized that the formal knowledge had a higher degree of certainty than material investigation did. But they also realized the only way you can go know the world, you get outside of your own mind, is through the senses.
It's through observation.
And so they were committed to the basic reliability, not the perfection, but the basic reliability of sense perception. And there's an interaction between that and the formal, like mathematics. Look how important mathematics has been to the advance of modern science. But it always drives me crazy when I hear all these debates, how little understanding of epistemology is there, how much that was assumed by earlier generations and explored deeply to say, how do we know anything?
Well, this is why
it's just jumped over.
One of the reasons I appreciate the work of David Hume so much, because he exposes the absolute dependence of the scientific endeavor on presuppositions that make no sense apart from a theistic commitment. My football player student was very impressed with this when he read Hume. Hume starts with trying to questioning the uniformity of nature and causality in these things, and finds that he can't actually justify them on the basis of pure empiricism, that they are either something that you assume and then go forward and do science, or if you question them, then you end up in a position of skepticism. But those assumptions of the uniformity of nature, the assumption of causality, that all events have causes, are things that make sense in light of a theistic worldview. God is a God of order who makes the world in an orderly way. He makes our minds with the assumption that all events have causes and that nature is uniform, so that the assumptions that we have built into us, the Kantian synthetic a priori, are also things that are true about the world. So you get this principle of correspondence within a theistic worldview that gives us a reason to trust our minds and the things that we assume.
And makes causal thinking possible.
Exactly. It makes knowledge of the world possible.
Now, in this whole discussion of intelligent design, we know what's at stake. It is the ultimate question of theism. Because when we talk about intelligent design, we're not thinking of a UNIVAC computer that's controlled by the Wizard of Oz. But we're talking about some intelligence that is uncanny in its scope and its extent, corresponding very nicely to the biblical understanding of a God who not is only intelligent and knowledgeable, but he's omniscient. He has all knowledge. And when we see the scope of that in the investigations into the tiniest cell and so on, what does that do to your soul, Stephen?
Let me come back to the soul question in just a second. I really do want to answer that. But let me unpack the relationship between the theory of intelligent design and these larger theological questions that arise from it. In formulating the theory of intelligent design, and I in particular, have relied on some standard methods of scientific reasoning, a principle that actually Darwin pioneered in investigating events in the remote past. He had a principle of reasoning, and that is that if you're trying to explain an event in the remote past, you should rely on our knowledge of the cause and effect structure of the world, and you should be looking for a cause which is known to have the power to produce the effect in question. Principle of sufficient or adequate reason. He got this from his mentor Charles Lyell, who put it this way. He said, in investigating the past, we should be looking for causes now in operation. When I came across that phrase in Lyell, for me the nickel dropped, because I had gone off to Cambridge, having been exposed to some of these early pioneers in the ID movement, who thought there was an intuitive connection between information and intelligence. And I had a burning question, which was, could that intuitive connection be formulated as a rigorous scientific argument? So naturally I began to study Darwin, and I came across this principle of reasoning that was key to his method of studying the events in the remote past. And when I got to the phrase in Lyell, when he said that we should be looking for causes now in operation, I asked myself a question. What is the cause now in operation for the production of digital information? And I realized there was only one. There's only one cause of which we know that's capable of producing information, and that's intelligence. And so I realized that by using Darwin's own principle of reasoning, I could formulate the case for design as a rigorous scientific, what's called an inference to the best explanation, where the best explanation is the one that relies on a cause that's known to produce the effect in question, and that cause is the only one that we know about.
Occam understood.
Yeah, okay. So that's a scientific case for intelligent design. What does it establish? It establishes an intelligence with the causal attributes that we know from experience, that is to say, a cause which is at least as intelligent as ours. Okay? That's what you can know, as it were, scientifically, using the same methods that Darwin, Lyell, and those other scientists used. Now, that then raises some second-order questions. Who is that intelligence most likely to be? And there we go beyond the method, the scientific method of reasoning that Darwin pioneered, and we get into a realm of philosophical investigation. And what the media wants to often do is they'll say, well, listen, if you, Steve Meyer or Bill Dembski, admit that you think that the intelligence responsible for the design in life is God, therefore you're doing religion and not science. But it's actually a little more subtle than that. What we're doing is we're basing our case for intelligent design on standard methods of scientific reasoning and on scientific evidence. But the case once made has implications that go beyond the merely scientific. And so the media likes to confuse the basis of the case for intelligent design with the implications of the theory in order to stigmatize it as being merely religion. Now, that's a long preamble to your question.
Right, yes.
But now we get to where it's really interesting, which is, okay, Meyer, Dembski, Behe, who do you guys think the designer really is? Well, among the scientists who accept intelligent design, opinions do vary, not between Meyer, Dembski, and Behe. We're all Orthodox Christians. But there are advocates of intelligent design who are not Christians, who accept the evidence for intelligent design. And that makes sense, because you don't have to be a Christian or a Jew or a theist to see the compelling nature of the evidence. But having come to the conclusion that there is evidence of design, it does raise that second-order question. Now, here's the way I look at that. There are two basic possibilities. The intelligence could either be immanent and within the cosmos, or the intelligence responsible for the design we see in life could be transcendent, beyond the cosmos. I favor the latter option for a number of reasons, but I have scientific reasons that support my judgment in this. One is that in addition to the design you see in life, you also see design in the very fabric of the universe, and what physicists call the fine-tuning of the laws of physics and chemistry. Now, that's clearly not design that could be the result of the actions of any creature within the universe. That's pointing to something beyond the universe as a whole. And so when you look at the evidence of design both in biology and physics, I find that the theistic design hypothesis explains the whole ensemble of evidence or evidences better than, say, the space alien idea, which has some other intrinsic liabilities, like if you invoke, as Richard Dawkins did at the end of the film Expelled, the idea that, well, there's a space alien, and then he says, but that may have been the source of the signature of intelligence we see in life, but that alien would have had to have evolved as well. Well, if you can't get the evolutionary process going in the first place on Earth because it can't solve the information problem, kicking it to outer space doesn't solve the problem either.
The same problem with transcendence and immanence we run into in theological philosophical arguments when we deal with the question of being, and we describe God as an eternal self-existent being.
Right, exactly.
And then to explain the presence of any kind of creaturely being, and the immediate response of the skeptic is, well, why do we have to jump to a transcendent being to account for this? Why can't we posit a being within the universe who accounts for this, is what you're saying.
Right.
And I said, you have to understand, when we talk about transcendence, we're not talking about geography. We're not talking about where he lives, out there or in here. We're talking about an order of being. Mm-hmm. And if there's one piece of this universe that has the power of eternal self-existence, or the power of being within itself, it transcends everything else in the whole universe, and by its very being, its ontology, it's transcendent. And that's exactly what you're saying there.
It is, and this is where also conjoining the modern cosmological argument with the design argument, I think provides a very powerful case for theism. I've been talking about the evidence for design in biology, the information in DNA and so forth, but also in the fine-tuning of the laws of physics and chemistry. When you conjoin that with the evidence from modern cosmology that suggests that there is a singularity at the beginning of the universe, in which both time and space began, then I think you have a powerful case for a transcendent kind of cause. The Big Bang Theory and general relativity are bad news for materialism, because once the field equations of general relativity were solved by Stephen Hawking in 1968, it became clear that if general relativity is true, then there is a true singularity at the beginning of the universe. A singularity not just in time, but also in space. If you go back far enough, you get to an infinitely tight curvature in which there's no spatial volume. And I used to ask my students another question, which was, how much stuff can you put in zero spatial volume? The answer is nothing. What I think follows from that is that matter is a crummy candidate to be the thing from which everything else comes, exactly. that ultimate
I
ground
had
of
some
being.
correspondence with Carl Sagan before he died over these questions, and he was willing to go back to that last nanosecond before the Big Bang, but he didn't want to even venture before that. He said, we don't need to go before that. I said, yes, you do. You absolutely can't stop there if you're really going to be involved in scientific pursuit of knowledge. You have to go there. And he didn't want to go there. And because he knew that even though he states at the beginning of his book and of his television show, we have cosmos, not chaos. He didn't want to go where that absolutely demanded him to go.
The one explanation for the origin of the universe that doesn't work anymore is the one that says, that points to matter and energy.
Exactly.
Because when you get back to the singularity, the matter and energy are not something you can refer to anymore. So.
Exactly. Well, I've really enjoyed this interaction with you, Stephen.
Absolutely, R.C. It's nice
to
meet you in person.
Good to meet you, and I thank you so much for the book that you've written. I trust it'll help a lot of people besides that football player that came to see you.
No, thanks a lot.
The great prophecies in the Old Testament, I think, that talk about the Messiah are really numerous. Most of them are not veiled, by the way. I think that they are just really straightforward predictions of Jesus. But it begins in Genesis 3:15. Genesis 3:15 talks about a seed of the woman that will come. And and we know that he's going to be a male too, for it uses the personal pronoun, he. He will have his heel nipped by the serpent, that old dragon, the devil. Always uses the article with it, the serpent, the serpent. But on the other hand, this seed, this descendant, this son born to the woman will crush, really stamp on the head of the dragon, that old serpent, the devil. So we're told right off from the very beginning, and this is sometimes called the proto-evangelium, the first announcement of the gospel. And indeed it was the first announcement of the gospel there in Genesis 3:15. The next one, I would think, is in Genesis 9:27. There, the Messiah, we are told, will come from the Shemites, or the Semitic peoples, for God will come and will dwell. He will tabernacle in the tents of Shem. And then we are told that Genesis 12:3, where Abraham is told that God says, I'll give you a son, I'll make your name great, I'll give you this land for an inheritance, and in your seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. And Paul, when he heard that in Galatians 3:8, he said, did you hear that? He says, that's good news, that's the gospel. In your seed, in your son, to be born to you and to your line, every Gentile, all the nations are going to be blessed on planet Earth. And so we really have the Great Commission. We have missions here too as well. It is a great statement. And mission, the whole mission of Messiah continues through the rest of the Old Testament, particularly Isaiah 7:14 and Isaiah 9, where he speaks of a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and his name shall be called Emmanuel. And then we are told that a son shall be born to you, whose name is really a beautiful name. And his name is Wonderful Counselor, Almighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. These are great names. No child was ever named that. And I think they are speaking of Messiah that is to come. These are just a few of the texts that are in the Old Testament. The new birth is to capture everything that we lost in the fall, both through Adam's activity and then through our own sin too, which we must not forget, in which we reenact some of the same things, and because of our depraved natures, we also are sinners indeed, as well as in our identification with Adam.